One of the world's most famous airline captains announced he's living with Alzheimer's disease. Captain Chesley Sullenberger recently revealed his diagnosis.
17 years ago, a man everyone called Captain Cool proved that calm could save 155 lives in 208 seconds. Today, that same man is facing an opponent that no amount of composure can outmaneuver, and for the first time in his public life, Chesley Sullenberger is not the one flying the plane. On July 14, 2026, a statement appeared on Sullenberger's personal website that stopped a great many people mid-scroll. The retired US Airways captain, now 75 years old, revealed that he had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. He described the condition in his own words as the unwanted visitor at the door, a phrase he credited to his physician, Dr. Gil Rabinavasai of the UCSF Memory and Aging Center. It was a line that carried the same restraint people remembered from the cockpit of Flight 1549, precise, unadorned, and somehow more devastating for its plainness. To understand why this news landed the way it did, it helps to remember who Sullenberger was before the world knew his name. Born in Denison, Texas, in January 1951, he grew up in a household that prized quiet discipline over noise, the kind of upbringing that produces people who do the hard thing and then don't talk about it. He earned a glider license at 14, attended the United States Air Force Academy, and later flew the F-4 Phantom II before transitioning into commercial aviation. Along the way, he built a second, less visible career studying why airplanes fail and how trained crews keep failure from becoming catastrophe. He served on accident investigation boards. He helped shape crew resource management protocols that airlines still teach today. Nobody watching him walk down a jet bridge in the 1990s would have guessed that this soft-spoken safety obsessive was rehearsing, without knowing it, for the single afternoon that would define him. That afternoon came on January 15, 2009. US Airways Flight 1549 climbed out of LaGuardia Airport bound for Charlotte when it struck a flock of Canada geese roughly 2 minutes after takeoff. Both engines lost thrust almost simultaneously. With no realistic path back to a runway, Sullenberger made the decision to ditch the Airbus A320 in the Hudson River, a maneuver so precise that the aircraft stayed intact on the water long enough for all 155 people aboard to evacuate onto the wings before rescue boats arrived. He later told interviewers that the seconds before touchdown produced the worst sinking feeling of his life, a detail he shared with journalist Jeffrey Zaslow while co-writing his 2009 memoir, Highest Duty. The book went on to inspire Clint Eastwood's 2016 film Sully, with Tom Hanks in the title role, introducing Sullenberger's story to a generation that had only known it as a headline. What followed the landing was not simply celebrity. It was a second career, deliberately chosen, built around service rather than spectacle. He retired from commercial flying in 2010 after 3 decades in the industry, then spent the next 15 years as a safety consultant, a CBS News aviation analyst, a congressional witness during the Boeing 737 MAX investigations, and eventually the United States ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization, a post he held under President Biden beginning in 2022. Through all of it, colleagues have described a man who treated his fame less as a reward and more as a responsibility, something to be spent carefully in service of people who would never know his name. That pattern of treating hard truths as public property rather than private burdens is not new for Sullenberger. In Highest Duty, he wrote candidly about his father's death by suicide in 1995, a disclosure that turned him, somewhat reluctantly, into an advocate for mental health awareness. He was similarly open about experiencing symptoms resembling post-traumatic stress in the weeks after the Hudson landing, admitting to sleeplessness and intrusive flashbacks even as the country celebrated him as a hero. Friends and former colleagues have pointed out, in the wake of this latest announcement, that Sullenberger has never been a man who hides behind the myth built around him. He has always seemed more interested in being useful than in being untouchable. The Alzheimer's diagnosis follows that same instinct. According to the statement he released, and reporting from CNN and the Deseret News, Sullenberger began noticing subtle changes roughly a year before going public, difficulty recalling names, catching himself repeating stories he had already told, disrupted sleep. He described himself as being at the beginning of this long journey, language that echoes the understated tone he used decades earlier when describing the mechanics of a water landing rather than dramatizing it. His wife of nearly 4 decades, Lori Sullenberger, offered her own reflection alongside his, describing him as the same steady presence he has always been, both before and after the Hudson, and again now. She noted that although the future is uncertain, the family intends to keep living fully and finding joy in ordinary moments, a sentiment that feels less like a slogan and more like a plan. Sullenberger's decision to name his physician publicly, and to describe his treatment relationship with UCSF's memory and aging program in some detail, is itself notable. Dr. Rabinavasai and his colleagues at UCSF have spent years working on earlier detection methods for Alzheimer's, research that has become increasingly relevant as blood-based biomarker tests move closer to clinical use. According to the Alzheimer's Association, more than 7 million Americans and over 55 million people worldwide are currently living with the disease, numbers that are expected to rise sharply as the population ages. Sullenberger's announcement arrived notably alongside the Alzheimer's Association International Conference held in London in the summer of 2026, a timing that several outlets, including the Deseret News, suggested was deliberate rather than coincidental. He has said explicitly that he wants his openness to spare other families the isolation that so often accompanies a diagnosis like his, framing himself now as part of a larger community rather than a singular case study in courage. There is a particular kind of significance in a man whose entire public identity rests on split-second clarity, choosing to speak about a disease that slowly erodes exactly that. Alzheimer's does not announce itself the way a bird strike does. It arrives quietly, in misplaced names and repeated stories, and it does not offer the tidy resolution of a plane gliding safely onto water. Medical experts are clear that there is currently no cure, and that symptoms typically progress over time even when they begin mildly. But they also note that earlier diagnosis, aided by tools like the ones being developed at UCSF, has given patients diagnosed in the current decade more options for planning and treatment than were available even 10 years ago. Sullenberger has framed his own case in exactly those terms, not as a tragedy to be mourned in advance, but as a condition to be met with the same discipline he once brought to a cockpit checklist. It's worth being precise about what this diagnosis does and does not mean for Sullenberger's public life. He has not announced a withdrawal from advocacy or public service. If anything, his statement reads as an argument for the opposite, a continuation of the same instinct that made him testify before Congress about aircraft certification failures and speak at the World Economic Forum about crisis leadership. He has said that for years, whenever people asked him about the outcome of Flight 1549, he liked to tell them that courage can be contagious. Now, in his own words, he is applying that same idea to facing Alzheimer's in the open rather than in private, hoping that his visibility might make the disease a little less frightening, a little less isolating, for the millions of families quietly living with it already. Those close to the family say his daughters, Katie and Kelly, have rallied around him in the weeks since the diagnosis became public, describing a household that has always leaned on routine and honesty during hard moments, the same qualities that carried Sullenberger through decades of an airline schedule and a demanding public role. He has continued to grant interviews and issue statements in his own voice rather than letting others narrate the story for him, a choice that mirrors the instinct that once made him walk the aisle of a sinking aircraft twice, checking that every seat was empty before he allowed himself to consider his own safety. That was never really about heroism in the way the headlines described it. It was about finishing the job properly, about making sure everyone else was accounted for first. Those who know him say that instinct has not gone anywhere. What makes this chapter of Sullenberger's story land so heavily is not that a famous man is aging, or even that he is facing a disease with no cure. It's that the same qualities that made him extraordinary on January 15, 2009, steadiness, honesty, a refusal to dramatize what didn't need dramatizing, are now being asked to carry him through something with no clean landing at all. There will be no water to glide onto this time, no rescue boats arriving within minutes, no tidy ending broadcast on the evening news. There is only the slow, uncertain work of living with a diagnosis, one ordinary day at a time, with the people he loves close by. And if his decades of public life have taught anything, it's that he intends to meet this the way he has met everything else, plainly, honestly, and without asking anyone to look away. For a man who once became famous for saving strangers, this final act of openness may end up being his quietest kind of courage, and perhaps his most enduring gift to everyone still watching.